just to frame my presentation, I will mainly talk about indeed the Flemish school context. I will focus specifically on mainstream schools, and the research project I'll talk about is specifically in primary education. But just to give you a brief background about Belgium, what I find very fascinating is I think it's for the first time that I'm introduced as somebody coming from Flanders. It says a lot of the process of federalization we are going through in Belgium. I mean, as you know, a lot of people in Flanders are very much in favor of splitting the country, which I think for the next couple of weeks won't happen because we're going to have a new king next week. Anyway, in terms of languages and language policies, the context of Belgium is from outside often seen as a multilingual context, a very multilingual context, multilingual policies. But in reality, except for Brussels, this is not the case. I mean, the two major regions in Belgium being Wallonia in the south and Flanders in the north, since 1963, there is a language law which says that the only language that is allowed to be used in official contexts, of which education is one, is, in the case of Flanders, is Dutch. So the only language of instruction which is allowed to be used in schools is Dutch. So theoretically, bilingual education programs aren't allowed by law. Now, given that these specific language tensions historically, diachronically, within the Flemish context, you have to realize that there is a lot of banning of immigrant languages in classrooms, and I'm not familiar with the UK context, and I know that monolingualism and monolingual habitus is a very universal concept, but definitely in Flemish schools, and I'll give a couple of examples later, in the Flemish school context, in almost all Flemish schools, even my kids' school, there is in the school regulations, there is something which says the only language which is allowed to be used in the school is Dutch, standard Dutch. This sometimes, in many cases, leads to situations where children are punished when they speak their mother tongue, home language on the playground or in the classroom. So this is more or less the reality, but I'll come back to that later. So what I would like to share with you is what I think that are, in my view, again specifically within the Flemish context, some urgent language education issues. I would like to briefly go into the current frames of reference that are being used, and I'll advocate for what I might call new frames, which are very much in line with what Angela already referred to. And one of them is a plea for a more functional approach of plurilingual learning than the current approaches we see in Flanders, and to a large extent worldwide, I think. And then I'll talk about a research project and the results of that approach. I'm not familiar with the you all know PISA. Yeah, everybody knows PISA nowadays. It determines our thinking, our policy making. There is an interesting 2012 book, How Global Governance Through PISA Determines Language and Policy Making in General, which is in my view a concern. But thanks to PISA, at least we know that there is definitely in Flanders an enormous social inequality and unequal outcomes in education, and these are a tenacious problem. Just to give you one example, the PISA data of 2000 compared to the 2009 PISA data, we saw that 38% of the explained variance goes to socioeconomic background. In 2009, it went up to 42%. So almost half of the variance that can be explained is due to the social background of kids, of which the majority of immigrant children are in a context of living in lower socioeconomic, with lower socioeconomic backgrounds. what we also see, and this is unfortunately also thanks to PISA, is that the languages that are spoken at home are often invoked as the explanatory variable. Now, the fact that there is a correlation, between the language I speak at home and school success, there are definitely correlations. In most PISA studies, not only in Flanders, there are correlations. But two things, these correlations are very low, that's one thing, but they are significant. But the problem is that even the PISA people and policymakers and we, society at large, we interpret these correlations not just as correlations, but we interpret these in a causal way. Which means that the language I speak at home causes low success at school. Now, is it possible that it can be the other way around? That due to the fact that I have a powerful learning environment in the school context, that I start to acquire the target language, that this might have an impact on the kind of language choices I make in the home context. But this idea, this theoretical possibility, is completely ignored. So language is seen as pivotal and as a key to school success. So what are the prevailing reference frames? Definitely a monolingual ideology, or the monolingual habitus, as Ingrid Gobelin calls it. Still, again, I'm not familiar enough with the UK context, but you have to be aware of the fact that Flanders was, and still is when it comes to pedagogy, is very much influenced by French tradition of pedagogy. So language is still, the fact that language is a system and that system has to be taught is very central still in language teaching. Languages, as Angela already referred to, as discrete units, and maybe the most problematic thing, and this goes beyond languages, is that when it comes to learning and when it comes to try to improve our learning context in school, we think from a deficiency paradigm. We always think in terms of deficiencies. Migrants have problems. Migrants have language problems. There's nothing else than problems. And the only thing what is important is there is a certain norm, and you deviate from that norm, and we'll try to do our best in order to get there where we want you to get. So these are the reference frames where we start. When it comes to monolingual ideology as a frame of reference, I'm sure that these things are very familiar, but it is part of, definitely, again, in the Flemish context, the official national language is seen as a powerful index of group belonging, and its mastery as pivotal for maintaining national order. In Flanders, in places like Bruges or other places, there are more and more the local politicians who stand up and who try to get rid of all the non-Dutch signs in bars, in public spaces. So recently there was in Bruges an incident on a guy who wanted to open a chip shop, is that what you call it? And he had a French name for it, and one of the local politicians said, no, you can't have it in French, it has to be in Dutch. So that's more or less the idea of Flanders as a new nation. And these monolingual education paradigms are ingrained so deeply that it even provokes resistance to multilingual practices within school settings among parents and pupils from the targeted linguistic minorities. Interesting, and I'll come back to that later. When we introduced in 2008 a multilingual research project on multilingual education in primary schools in Ghent, the first thing we did was we interviewed the parents, and a majority of the parents were completely against the idea. There was even one father who said, if you start this project, he addressed himself to the principal, if you start participating in a project, I'll withdraw my child from the school. So there is a strong belief that the only thing which is important is Dutch, and if my child doesn't master Dutch, it won't be successful in society. The consequence of all that is that we are often immune to cognitive and academic dissonances, and these are often palmed off as commonsensical thinking, or as Bourdieu, the French sociologist, calls it, as doxas.